Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the structural framing industry. Regardless of how you touch this industry, we're glad you're here. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, I'm Sean Shields, Director of Marketing for SBCA, and I'll be your host for this episode of Component Connection. I'm joined by Greg Greenlee, SBCA's Technical Director. Greg and I just finished exhibiting at the annual summit for the National Council of Structural Engineers Association, or NCSEA, in New York City. It was a week of great conversations with structural engineers from across the country. And on this episode, we're going to break down the value of having a presence at this event. Greg, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Sean.
So, Greg, this was a pretty different experience than the AIA conference we attended earlier this year in Boston. It was geared towards architects. In a big picture sense, I mean, what did you like about the NCSEA annual summit?
Well, probably a little biased, but as a structural engineer, I felt like I was back home with my people, so to speak, versus the architectural crowd, which is a little bit more of a fish out of water. So, yeah, I certainly felt like I was back home, so I enjoyed that part of it. But what I think really makes NCSEA Summit a neat show is it's just so education focused. And everyone that goes there, all of the attendees, that's the mindset they're in, and it's just kind of how engineers are. They go to things like this. They have a certain number of CEUs that they need to get every year. They're trying to stay on top of their craft from an education standpoint. So that's the mindset that come to this. So when you are exhibiting or presenting or doing whatever at one of these shows, you're meeting everyone at this place where they're eager to hear what you have to say. It was just a great atmosphere for you to be able to tell the story of SBCA.
It was very clear, Greg, you were in your element when we were standing in the education booth, right? Like a lot of people were coming up and asking questions, and whether or not you started the response or I did, at some point, you would weigh in on things, and you were very clearly speaking their language on all fronts.
Plus, there's all these jokes you can tell that the greatest crowd, and they get them. So,
one of my favorite engineering jokes is, why aren't engineers good at telling jokes timing?
Right, exactly.
And that would have gone over huge.
To that end, we had a lot of quality discussions in our booth. As you pointed out, it seems like a lot of people were there for education, to learn things, to perfect their craft. And so there wasn't a lot of people just sort of wandering past our booth, trying not to make eye contact. Like a lot of times, people walking by, they were very interested in like what we were all about. From the conversations that you had with those many professional engineers, what were some of the best conversations that you focused on?
Well, I guess all the conversations were great, but there certainly was a theme or kind of a pattern that you picked up after a while. And, you have to think about it, how these engineers are approaching it. They're looking at what we do, and what they need to know is, what do they need to understand to be able to do their job? And probably the first thing that pops out is, what exactly is the role of an engineer of record in our whole process? And just so they understand, what are their responsibilities? What do they need to do on their drawings? What are they reviewing? What are they looking for? A lot of conversations about who's designing what and what's the responsibility, whether it's the tie down of the truss or whatever. But just kind of generally that theme of roles and responsibilities, particularly of the engineer of record. And then maybe a little more specifically, but probably the most common question that came up was gable and truss bracing. And that design and the flow of forces, and what type of information should they put on the drawing from the gable and bracing and things like that. Just some really, really good conversations as far as that end. And probably my biggest takeaway from all of those conversations, I think about with the E&T committee, we're constantly working on technical documents. And in a lot of ways, it validated a lot of the efforts that we're doing. In particular, we have created documents that explain this role and responsibility. So it was great to be able to provide that. But then along the same lines, the Gable and Truss brace, that's a great example of, we really should develop a piece of literature that addresses that we can provide to this engineering community that's looking for it. So it provides validation of what we're doing, and then also gives us good direction of where we need to go.
I did think it was interesting. We had printed up these water bottle stickers. There's these tiny little stickers that have a truss on them, and it says underneath, "Trusses by others." And we had originally created these when we went to the AIA conference, and we handed them out, and we got a few chuckles from that group, right?
Yeah.
But here, I feel like every single person took it, looked at it, read it, and laughed.
Yeah, it was like belly
like,
laughs.
That's what I put in my plans, right? Trusses by others. And it did give us a chance to be like, yeah, and we're the others. And, that whole Gable End bracing discussion, I think was really fascinating, because a lot of them were like, yeah, trusses by others. Like that should not be my responsibility. That's the truss designer, right? And, giving us an opportunity to explain why that isn't the case, I think was a really good exercise in understanding not everybody is perfectly aware of that division of responsibility or what our industry does and doesn't do, or can and cannot do, right?
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
So another thing that we had an opportunity to do in partnership with NCSEA while we were there is we helped run a roof construction competition for young engineers at the event. We had tested this out at an SPCA open quarterly meeting, but essentially it was giving them a bunch of very lightweight balsa wood material, not tongue depressors, but sort of 12-inch long, 1/8 by 1/8 inch dowels, some tape, and a few other materials, and gave them 80 minutes to build a roof structure. We didn't specify that it had to be a truss structure, and it had to basically withstand a pound of load in the center of the span, and had to span more than 28 inches. I was curious, as you walked around and watched all of these young engineers trying to tackle this problem from various different angles, what did you see and what did you like, and what sort of reinforced some of the education that we need to try to provide to young engineers?
Yeah, to me, that truss design or building experience that we hosted was one of the neatest parts of the whole show. It's like, as you mentioned, we're talking to engineers that are just at the beginning of their career, or still in school. And I can remember years and years ago when I was in that situation, and everyone had a mentor that they looked up to and kind of brought them along the way. And it's just neat to, be able to walk into that role and see it happening before your eyes. When you walked around and you saw what everyone was working on, and you said it at the time, Sean, they had 80 minutes to build it, and they had no idea that wasn't going to nearly be enough time. I think initially they thought, oh, I've got all this time, but then there's the inevitable mad dash at the end. But what I saw when you could see what they were developing, the path they were going down, is they had a pretty decent command of solving a two-dimensional problem. So they were looking at this truss in a two-dimensional plane, and they had figured out the triangulation, how that was effective and everything. But then when they put their truss together, or their bridge together, usually a pair of trusses connected somehow, and they started loading it, immediately their eyes, you could just see it on their face that they had missed some of the three-dimensional parts of this problem. So the restraint and bracing, getting the lateral torsional buckling is the technical term for that. The common failure mode that we saw were these, all these trusses basically just behave like a two-dimensional thing, and they kind of twisted and turned and collapsed sideways. And that was the failure mode of most of the bridges that we saw. There were a couple, one that they had apparently figured out in design, because it was pretty well braced between the two major members going across. And then the other one that I recall seeing was they were just really, really good at placing the weight on top of their bridge. So everything was perfectly actually loaded. I mean, if they would have had that off just one little bit, one way or the other, that thing was going to collapse. But yeah, it was just so neat to see, the light bulbs go off in their heads and just start to figure that out. And then, I had conversations with some of the participants afterward, and they're already ready for next year. It's like, okay, game on. I learned something here. I'm ready to capitalize that and come after it next year.
Right. Well, it'll be fun to change all the parameters of the contest next year. But, essentially, yes, we'll totally mess with them. But at the end of the day, the really interesting part is what you said. It's giving them a real world opportunity to witness the importance of things like restraint and bracing in that three-dimensional space. Again, something that is going to be part of their role and responsibility is designing that permanent lateral restraint and bracing, and how important that is for a truss system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The other aspect too, and I think Jay Jones was the one that mentioned this, is when they sat down, they were in teams of 3, and they may or may have not known the other people on their team. But even if they knew them, in a short amount of time, they have to come to some type of an agreement about what they're going to do. So there's a management skill in that, and a teamwork skill that really stood out. And you could see that some of the groups were a little, kind of just feeling it out for a while. And it took them a little bit of time to get going, because they had to really navigate through that process of how are they going to make decisions as a team. First, no one wanted to offend or upset anyone, but then clock's ticking, so you got to start making decisions.
Well, this event also gave us an opportunity to promote SBCA's live education series, The Component Craft, which we are launching next February in Austin, Texas, and then we'll have hopefully other events throughout the country over the following year. I'm curious, why do you think events like the one that we're planning will be beneficial to the professional engineers who, for instance, attended the NCSEA Summit?
Well, I guess, first of all, you were the master at working component craft into just about any conversation you could have with someone there. I did notice that. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Bringing it right. Yes. Well, I think it really feeds off of what we talked about a little bit ago. I mean, you think about when these engineers were coming to our booth and talking to us, they had these really legitimate questions. And as I said before, their mission is to figure out what they need to know to be able to do their job. And the component craft is going to be an excellent opportunity for that, whether it's walking through the roles and responsibilities, exactly what they're supposed to be doing or what they don't have to do, or what the truss engineer is going to do or not do, just gaining that understanding. Or maybe it's better understanding of the design of permanent lateral restraint and bracing or special inspection requirements. Just a lot of these things that the process we have is, what we would call a delegated design process. And while there's other materials that use a similar delegated design process, ours is fairly unique in the industry. So I think there's just that real desire to understand what it is and what they need to know.
It strikes me that it's kind of akin to our truss designers, right? That we, at a certain level, sit them down in front of the software and they're inputting data from the plans into the software. But it's important for them to have a background understanding of what that software is doing, so that when things don't work out quite right, or they know when something doesn't look quite right, they kind of know maybe what's going on. And I feel like this is the same thing. A lot of people came up and said, I like trusses because delegated design, as you just said, right? They don't have to think or worry about it. But it is important and good for them to understand how our industry works and to know, sort of, as we've talked about in this episode, what are some of the areas where they really have to have a fundamental understanding of trusses and how they perform and how they're designed, so that as they're going back and designing, whether it's that gable end bracing or the permanent bracing or any number of things, even it's reviewing the truss submittal package correctly and being able to evaluate the truss design drawings to make sure they're meeting expectations. All of those things are important for them to have a background and understanding of, so that they know when it doesn't look right, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they kind of followed a lot of the conversations we had last week. Like you said, the the comment I said, I like the delegated design because I don't have to worry about it. And my response was, well, yes, with a big asterisk after that. You don't have to design the truss, but the truss is just a piece of your building that you are responsible for the design of. So you need to understand that that component has been designed to the criteria you have established, and you need to know how to review that job submittal package to make sure it is represented and says what it's supposed to say. So yeah, the engineer, while he's not actually designing the truss, still has a lot of responsibility and input into the full process that works into the building design.
Yeah, it underscores that value in making sure that our industry is talking regularly with their industry, and that there's that full understanding between both industries, right?
Right, absolutely. And the other interesting part about it, and why Component Crafts is such a great opportunity, is most engineers graduate from some university or college with a degree in engineering. Probably, if they had a timber design course, it certainly didn't get into the process of delegated design like we work with. It was just truly designing with wood. So a lot of the knowledge that they have about this process and how it works is whatever they picked up at their firm or their colleagues or mentors or whoever it may have been. Well, people can teach good habits as well as they can teach bad habits. So to have the opportunity to present the industry standpoint, this is how this process works and everything, I think is really valuable, because even people that have been doing it a lot of years, may not quite have all the facts quite straight. So it's a great opportunity then for check what they've been doing to see if it matches with the industry practice.
Excellent. Well, again, the summit was a good first step in that process of helping to forge that communication between us and the engineers. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives on the podcast.
Absolutely. It was great to be here.
And thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of SBCA's podcast, Component Connection. If you enjoyed this episode and found it valuable, please like it and share it with others. Stay up to date and in the know by subscribing to Component Connection on whatever platform you use most.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com.